Stanford University.
Okay, everyone, we're gonna get going here. Welcome to another exciting episode of CS 193P. I think I already made that joke already this quarter. But we're going to be talking about text input today and presenting content modally. These are two kind of disparate topics that we're going to fold together into part 3 of the Presence assignment. So you're going to be needing to know about both of these things for Presence 3, which is due next Tuesday. So there's an updated Presence 3 files.zip up on the website. If you've already done Presence 2, which I think most of you probably have, you're familiar with the Twitter helper class. There's some additions to that class which will enable you to do some of the required pieces for Presence 3. And as usual, it's due on Tuesday at midnight. We're getting kind of down to the end of the quarter, so if you've got some late days and you feel like using them and messing up Troy and Paul's plans for the days after the due dates, go for it. One important thing to note is that late days cannot be used on the final project. I don't know if we've really emphasized this up until this point, but that is the case. They're due on Sunday, June something, 6th. June 6th or 7th. It's a Sunday. No late days on that because obviously our final exam slot is the following day. So late days, use them if you've got them, I guess. And then as we've been mentioning the last couple of classes, final project proposals, we'd really like to have those by Monday. So the earlier the better. If you can send it to us, then we can go back and forth with you if we've got feedback or if we want you to go in a different direction with it. The earlier the better before you actually start writing code. And as we mentioned before, you can do it by yourself. You can do it in groups of 2. Those are kind of our ideal arrangements for these things. On those lines, I wanted to ask a quick question. I don't know if we've done this at any point in the quarter. Does anyone here actually have apps on the App Store right now? We've got a couple people. 1, 2, 3, 3.5. Okay, I was just wondering. So yeah, this will be a great opportunity for you to make that foray if you haven't yet. A bunch of our students last time around submitted their apps to the App Store all sort of in a big group. They got some mentions on TechCrunch and a bunch of other blogs, and they got a bunch of publicity for it. So if you're interested in doing that sort of thing, you maybe want to seek out some other students and figure out how to make a big splash with whatever your final project is. In addition, I'm referring to it as the bonus section instead of the optional section to make it kind of sound cooler, although I think we've had pretty good attendance. But this Friday, usual spot 200-205, it's going to be with Steve Marmon, who is a current Stanford master's student and soon-to-be Apple employee, as long as he doesn't say anything bad about Apple. And he's going to be talking, he's going to be kind of taking a step back from all the code that we've been talking about in the past few weeks, talking about interface design, some of the best practices there, and how you can really make a high-quality, polished-looking iPhone application. That doesn't, if you remember that screenshot from 4 or 5 weeks or 3 or 4 weeks ago when I had all those controls packed into the one screen, helping you to avoid making apps like that, really focused, nice-looking iPhone apps. Any other additions to that? Steve's a cool guy. Come, yeah.
Will we continue to have the sessions videotaped?
The question was, are we going to continue to have the sessions videotaped? It looks like the answer to that is yes, as far as I know. I think last Fridays with Lauren is up on iTunes U, and yeah, that's certainly the plan. So if you can't make it, you'll be able to catch up that way. But obviously, there is no substitute for being able to reach out and touch whoever the speaker is. So today's topics. Well, before we can get into that, any lingering presence questions, either for 2 or for 3? You can always resort to email, but it's more fun to make me squirm up here and try to answer them. If not, or if anything comes to mind, just throw your hand up. We're going to take a quick little diversion at the beginning and talk about something which relates to this sort of memory management, bug finding stuff that we were talking about last lecture. There's this really cool tool called the Clang Static Analyzer. I'm going to show you a little demo of how you can use it to find bugs in your app before you even run your app. And then we're going to jump into the meat of the lecture. We're going to be talking about text input and keyboards, how you access that sort of stuff from your app. And then we're going to talk about presenting content modally, which is a very common case where you want to do text input. These two things fit together for sort of the second half of the Presence 3 assignment. So you'll be happy you paid attention when you're sitting there in the middle of the night hacking away on Presence 3. So the Clang Static Analyzer, what is this thing? It's a tool for static analysis of C and Objective-C code. So static analysis versus dynamic analysis, during the last lecture, we were using instruments, in particular the leaks instrument, to look at our app as it was running and try to find bugs. And static analysis is a sort of different complementary approach where using some tools before you actually run the program, trying to find bugs or logic errors or that sort of thing. Has anyone here used Valgrind before in any of your classes? A fair number of people. So sort of along similar vein, it's something that you run on your code before you actually, static analysis. So what does it do? It tries to identify potential bugs. And the key here is potential. There are times when Clang won't find a bug. There are times when the Clang Static Analyzer will flag something that's not actually a bug. So it's imperfect, but it's very, very helpful. It's key, though, to not interpret, if it flags something, don't just go there and change the code without thinking about it. You should understand why you're making the change and then go ahead and do it. A really big thing here is leaks. It can help you find places where you maybe have mismatched your retain release statements. Using uninitialized or released variables. Uninitialized variables are a big one. As you know, with instance variables, they all get initialized to 0 when an object is created. But for a local variable within a function or method, that does not get zeroed out or anything. So if you declare int I at the top of your function, who knows what's in there? It could just be garbage. And then if you forget to initialize it and then use it, you can have some weird, unpredictable errors. You can also flag things like missing dealloc methods. If you've got some instance variables that are retained, you haven't overridden dealloc, it can actually point you toward that. And there's much more. There's a bunch of really common errors that can help you find in your code. As I mentioned, it's early in development. It's a work in progress. So have a healthy dose of skepticism when it reports things to you. But so watch out for false positives. It's open source. You can basically you can peer in and see what it's doing. It's actually, there's a few Apple employees who work on this, so there is some pretty serious engineering support behind this. But if you choose to, you can go and you can contribute fixes, you can work on it yourself. There's more info at the address here, clang.llvm.org/staticanalysis.html. And there's everything you would ever want to know about Clang there, how to download it, how to install it, how to run it. But I'm actually going to show you here how to do that as well, because a demo is worth 1,000 websites of trying to read through somebody's documentation. So to run it, just to give you a quick overview, one really key thing is to do a clean build in Xcode first, because what Clang is going to do is it's actually going to compile your code, and as it's compiling it, it's going to try and make some inferences about what you're doing. If you've already built your project in Xcode and then you tell the static analyzer to try and do it, it might skip over some source files that haven't changed since your last build. So it's always important to do a clean build in Xcode. I think the keyboard shortcut is Command-Shift-K. And then from the command line, you're going to run scan build. I usually use a couple of arguments here. K, I think, what that does is causes it to keep going even if it encounters errors during the build process. So if you've got a build error, it'll still try and build the other files. And -V is going to I believe that's what automatically causes it to display in your web browser, the results. And then from there, you just append your standard. Whenever you're building from Xcode, within the Xcode app, there's an equivalent way to build from the command line. So if I wanted to build my project, I'm within my project directory. I could type Xcode build, specify the configuration. Let's say we want the debug configuration. And I can specify the SDK version. Here, we're going to use iPhone Simulator 221. You can customize that as needed if you have some different configuration names, or you're on iPhone SDK 201 or 3.0 or whatever. And then the really cool thing in here is that when it's done, the results open up in Safari, and you can browse through them, and it'll actually annotate your code in the web browser and kind of point out what it's trying to do. So let's do a quick demo here of the Clang Static Analyzer. I've got a little project here, which I've been working hard to introduce bugs in. So we've just got a standard window-based application. Actually, before I do that, I want to show you what actually gets pulled down by. Clang. There we go. So here's the Clang Static Analyzer website. It gives you a lot of the same information that I just told you about false positives and ways to use the tool. And then down here at the bottom of the page, there is, if you'll excuse me for one moment as I turn on the Zoom. There we go. So there's a download here. They do a sort of, I don't know if it's a nightly build, but every so often from the open source, Clang sources, they build this for you, which you can download. And if I look here in my downloads folder, I've got this directory which I've unzipped, and here it's got all the Clang checker stuff inside it. So then what I've done here actually, so that I can invoke these tools from the command line wherever I am, I have added that directory to my bash profile. I don't know if any of you guys are terminal command line hackers, but this is how I get it so that I can just type scan-build and it'll find that stuff in the directory where it lives. You might want to maybe install this someplace, /developer or /whatever. But this allows me to not have to type the full path to all the command line tools. Apologies if there's any VI users in the audience. So I've got that hanging out, and I've got this project. I called it Clang Me because I couldn't think of anything else. And I've declared this class. I've got some class, and I've got some dubious methods in here. Now that you're all expert Objective-C programmers, you're probably going to notice some of the errors right away. So here I've got this method where maybe leak objects. I create this string, I retain it, and then maybe depending on the Boolean value, I might release it or I might not. So this is a case where it's possible that I'm leaking this string. So that's a problem. Here I've got this Boolean, I didn't initialize it, and then I'm going to check the value, and who knows, there might be garbage in there, it might be zeroed out, so this could be kind of unpredictable behavior in my app. And the last thing down here is a little bit more subtle. I've got this full name method. Anyone see what the problem is here? May not be immediately obvious. Yeah. Yeah, so this method, it doesn't have copy or alloc or retain in the name, but it's not returning an auto-released object. It's returning an object with a retain count of 1. So this is kind of a subtle bug. It's not going to cause, none of these are going to cause build errors or warnings. But especially, from the viewpoint of like what the standard Objective-C, conventions are as far as naming. Somebody else who's working with this code, they're going to see full name, and they're not going to know that they need to release it. So that's a problem. Good eye. So from here, I'm going to go to the build menu in Xcode, and you'll notice alongside, build and go, all that stuff you've been using, there's this clean command, Apple Shift K. I'm going to run that just to make sure that all of the sort of intermediate build files are cleared out, and Clang will have the full opportunity to build everything. And then from here, what I'm going to type is, just as I showed you before, scan build, a couple of command line options here. You can check those out on the website if you want to refresh your memory on those. And then I'm going to type the Xcode build command. So specify the configuration and specify the SDK version. If I hit return here, and if all goes well, it's going to invoke the standard Xcode build. All right, here we go. And it opened up the results in my web browser. So if I hit, bump up the font size here a little bit. So I've got my build results. Here's my working directory. And notice that from the terminal, I was in the project directory. So where ClangMe lives on disk, I was actually inside /ClangMe, the same place where the Xcode project and all my source files and whatnot live. So that tells you where we were. This tells me how I invoked the build command, gives me some other info here. And then it points out some bugs. We've got a leak of a returned object, a use of an uninitialized value. I can check these checkboxes here and it'll filter things out. That's kind of cool. It's actually running a web server. If you look here, localhost port 8181. So that's kind of what's going on. So from here, I can view report, and what that'll do, or I can open the file. If I click open file, it'll actually take me to the file in Xcode, which is kind of cool. If I want to go in and fix that bug. If I click view report, let's check these out one by one. View report here says, and it'll actually mark out, it'll kind of give you numbered steps of how we got here and what it thinks the problem is. So it says, okay, in a string that returns something with a 0 retain count, it's not owned. The reference count was incremented here, and then it tells you, hey, hypothetically, I'm going to take the false branch. So if we were to take the false branch here, we're not going to release this string. So that's a problem, right? And then it'll say object allocated on line 16 is no longer referenced and it has a retain count of +1. So it got leaked. Pretty cool, especially if you're just whipping out a bunch of code and you weren't really thinking about memory management and you just kind of left some leaks in there. Here's, zoom out a little bit. Dope. Let's go back there. If I view the reports for the other bugs, here we've got, for the full name method, it says, so we returned an object with a retain count of 1. And then object allocated on line 35 is returned from a method whose name does not contain copy or otherwise start with new or alloc. This violates the naming conventions and the memory management. So it knows about some sort of conventions here. It's not just a purely syntactical thing. It's actually doing some semantics as well. If we look at the third bug here, it says, third potential bug, excuse me, branch condition evaluates to uninitialized variable. So this hasn't been initialized. We can fix that by setting it to some initial value. There's lots of other bugs it can find. There's lots of other non-bugs that it may flag, especially around things like delegates, which we're going to be talking about more today. But it is a very valuable tool, and it can save you some grief down the road. Any questions about that before we go back to the slides? So one of your extra credit options, actually, for Presence 3 is to download the Clang static analyzer and try running it on your project. It may find some bugs for you. If you want to get the potential for the extra credit, you can actually include the output of when you ran Clang on your project, just to kind of prove that you actually ran it. But for fun, for profit, it's a good thing to do sometimes. So got that covered. This sort of relates to all the talk about memory usage, and there can even be performance bugs uncovered by Clang. It can note a case where you've done some computations and assigned a value to a variable and then never used that variable again. And that can point to one of two things. It could just mean that you're doing work that you don't have to, so it's like a performance issue, or maybe it's a serious logic issue where you've computed this stuff and then for some reason you forgot to use it later. So it can be either unnecessary work, or just sort of a big scary logic error. So that's super valuable, and that relates to the performance topics that we've been discussing. So from here, let's switch gears, and we're going to talk about iPhone keyboards. We kind of go in rapid fire here, just giving you an overview of the iPhone's keyboard system, what some of the features are, why we think virtual keyboards are really awesome, and then I'm going to show you a little bit later how to actually use them in your app. So as I mentioned, the iPhone has a virtual keyboard. It appears when needed, comes up and covers part of the screen. It'll work in landscape mode as well, which is really nice depending on how you prefer to hold your phone. Some apps do this and some don't. That is a frequently requested thing from our users. But in your app, you definitely want to support both of them, right? So, and it's got a simple selection model. You hold your finger down and you get a loop, a little magnifying glass, where you can precisely position the cursor. You don't have to sit there with your little hardware keyboard and go cursor right, cursor right, cursor right. You can just kind of drag and position. And there are a bunch of keyboard types, and they adapt to the task that is at hand and the application that you're using it in. So yeah, I don't know, WWDC is great. Here we've got the standard keyboard for text input. Here we're inputting a URL, so you'll notice at the bottom of the screen we got the dot and the slash and the .com, which actually if you tap and hold, does that happen in? Yeah, anyways. And you've got go instead of the return key. Little things like this, which users appreciate depending on the situation. If I'm typing an email address, I get the @ sign down there. If I'm entering a phone number, the whole thing changes, and I've got these big fat number keys I can hit. I've got this sort of custom-looking keyboard for when I'm inputting text for a Wi-Fi network. This is actually a keyboard as well when you're entering your PIN code on the lock screen. And all these things, would not be possible really with a hardware keyboard. It supports single line editing, so cases here where you're typing in a search query or something like that. Also multi-line editing, like in the Notes app, other places where you're implementing huge quantities of text. And as of iPhone 2.x, 20 languages supported. The nice thing here is that we can add support for more languages down the road. We can improve the language support. So given that all this stuff is virtual, if we hear that our users in Turkey or Korea or whatever, they want I don't know, we can move keys around, all that good stuff. Full dictionary support as well. So this is all built in. So here's we've got English going on. French, you'll notice we've got Azerty instead of QWERTY, and we can ship the same phone to all these people. Russian, so we can do non-Roman alphabets. We've got Korean here. Japanese, we can do Romaji input as well as kana. Chinese, we can do pinyin as well as a stroke-based input system. Yeah?
Is there a Dvorak keyboard layout?
Great question. Is there a Dvorak keyboard? No, there's not. Which saddens some members of my team who use the Dvorak keyboards. But we could add it, right? Yeah. So how would you handle a text field that only wants numbers, numbers and decimal characters? There are a couple ways to do that. You can specify. I'm going to talk about it a little bit later. Sort of the affinity of the keyboard, what kind of a keyboard it should show. So you can ask it to only show the numeric keys. There are also ways for you to validate. There are some text field or text view delegate methods where it'll ask the delegate every time a character is inputted. Can I append this character to this field? And you can then choose whether or not to allow it. So maybe you've got some field where the user can type numbers except for 7. So you could disallow.
I don't want anything else showing other than those keys.
Yeah. So it would probably be a combination of specifying the keyboard type, which I'll be demoing in a little bit, as well as possibly implementing some delegate methods on the text field's delegate. Is there a question there?
I was just curious, can developers actually create their own keyboard?
The question is, can developers create their own keyboards? The answer for that right now is no. So yeah, there are a lot of folks who write crossword apps for the iPhone. They want like a crossword specific keyboard. Currently, there's not a way to do that. So any other burning keyboard questions? So yeah, customizing text input segues very nicely here. Let's look at how you actually use this in your app, how you get some of these different behaviors. So we've got this idea of text containers. These are things, yeah?
Are you going to be calling spell checkers that go with the keyboard? Or
Covering, sorry?
spell checkers?
Spell checkers.
Or spelling correctors?
Yeah, we're not. The question was, are we going to be covering spell checkers or dictionary support? Yeah, not today. I mean, obviously, I mentioned like that kind of stuff is built in the language support. There are not facilities for you to customize that from an app point of view. So, for better or for worse. So, text containers here are things like text views, text fields, other places where you can input text. And if we kind of peel off the little shiny blue wrapper on top here, ways of customizing text containers include things like delegates. As I was mentioning, if you set yourself up as the delegate for a text field, you can influence the behavior by allowing or disallowing certain input, customizing the behavior when the return key is pressed, things like that. There are also notifications which get posted and broadcast to anyone who wants to hear about them. And then there are just straight up methods, properties, things you can poke the text field and say, hey, you should behave this way or that way. So these are a few ways to customize and influence the behavior of a text container. Another big thing here is this idea of text input traits. And this really comes into play. First of all, this is a protocol which both UI text field and UI text view conform to. A protocol that allows you to sort of influence how these text containers interact with the keyboard. So things like auto-capitalization, auto-correction, the type of the keyboard, whether it should be the URL keyboard or the plain text keyboard or the phone number keyboard or the number keyboard or whatever other keyboards there are, aspects of the keyboard appearance, the return key type, so you can have it say, search or go or whatever else down there, whether or not the return key should be disabled if there's no text. If you want to input passwords, that's also part of this text input traits protocol, that all these different these different classes can adopt. So you can do some things like saying I want the URL keyboard with a Go button, or a default keyboard with a Google button. Don't know how Google would feel about that if you put it in your non-Google related app, but c'est la vie. So the way this works is you've got this text container. It's got these ways of being customized, which includes the text input traits. And then when this thing, so these are things you specify at design time in your nib or in your code. And then you specify these text input traits. And then at runtime, when the keyboard actually comes up, and this text field becomes, first of all, the text field becomes first responder, which means it's the object that is going to get first crack at handling things like keyboard presses and all that. When it becomes first responder, it and the keyboard do this little dance, and the keyboard adopts the text input traits of the text field. So you're never interacting with the keyboard directly. There is actually really no public API for grabbing the keyboard and saying, hey, keyboard, you should display here with these traits. It's something that you set kind of lazily, is following the theme here, on the text field, and as needed, the keyboard will adapt itself to the traits of the text container. Does that make sense? So don't look for methods for interacting directly with the keyboard because they're not there in the SDK. So UI text field, UI text view, web forms as well also do this sort of stuff. So if you've got a web page and your user is browsing it with Safari or a UI web view, some of those text traits will come through. So let's do a quick little demo just of how we get some text input going on in a simple app and ways of customizing it. We're going to be using Interface Builder here, and it's not going to be rocket science. It's pretty simple, but I thought it'd be useful just to see it in action. I'm going to just to keep it simple, I'm going to create a window-based application. We're going to leave view controllers out of it for now, and let's call it type something. So we've got the window-based application that we all know and love. Let's crack open the main window, and at this point in the class, you're sort of starting to get a feel for the fact that most of the time, you're not going to be laying out UI in your main window nib, right? You're going to be maybe setting up a navigation controller or a tab bar controller, and then adding view controllers to it, each of which have their own nibs. But we're going to make an exception here just for the sake of the demo and add some stuff directly to the window. So let's add if we go to objects in the inspector here, again, please pardon my 1024 by 768 layout. I'm sure it'll be much more pleasant for you to look at on your computer. Let's add a text field. So drag this thing out here, just like any other view in Interface Builder. I can drag it over that way, stretch it out this way, set up the auto resizing masks. Why not? Now, if I click on this thing, and in the inspector, if I go to the first tab, which is, as you've probably seen before, the attributes tab, normally there's some options here for the background color and all that sort of basic view stuff. There's quite a few options when you've got a text container, because as I mentioned, it's got all these text input traits that it needs to conform to. And if we zoom in a little here, you'll see there's this whole section on text input traits. So I could do something like, say, capitalize. If we want to type in all caps and just piss everyone off, we can do all characters. We can have correction. I'm not sure exactly what default does. That's a good question. But let's say no correction. What?
You can turn it off in preferences.
Oh, okay. So Al informs me that choosing default will respect the user's preference in the settings, like the global iPhone app settings. Let's say no correction. So here's where we could say, we just want a number pad or a phone pad, which is geared more towards inputting phone numbers. You can do things like type the hash, the pound sign, and the star, whatever else. Email address, URL, whatever. Let's do default here. We'll just use the user's default input language and whatnot. If for some reason, I really want to just ASCII characters, like I've got I'm not sure what, but some sort of text field where we don't want them inputting text in, Korean or Russian, we could select that here. I'm just going to leave it with default. Most of the time here for the appearance, you're going to want the default appearance. The alert is that sort of darker tinted keyboard that is used with the Wi-Fi password entry. Return key, we've got a bunch of options here. I don't know. Next, sure, why not? We can make it secure, so it just shows the little circles, all that stuff. And then as well, so these text input traits apply to both UI text views and UI text fields. And then I can do things here specific to the text field, like setting some initial text. So if I, type hello there, hello will be the initial value of the text field. Or if I delete that, I can actually type some placeholder text, like type something here, which will have this grayed out text. And immediately when I first click it, that text won't be in there. It'll go away. Going back here, we can set, background disabled. I mean, there's all these view options. You can customize the appearance in whatever way you see fit. We can have it clear when editing begins. So if I type some text and then I go away and then I re-tap on it, we can have it automatically clear. This is useful for places like URL fields where your user often is going to want to tap on it and just start fresh. That's the behavior in the Safari app on the phone. I can set, and then you've seen a lot of this stuff before, the minimum font size and all that stuff. So yeah, that's how we get the text field on there. So you'll notice here, I basically just set up the text field. I didn't, and I set up the text input traits, but I didn't fool around with the keyboard directly. Now if I build and run from Xcode, we've got this text field here. I hope can you see it okay? If I tap here, simulating the user's touch on the device, you'll see the keyboard comes in. We've got this next button, which we specified for some reason. And if I start typing, you'll notice it's all in all caps because that's what we specified for some crazy reason. The shift key, looks like I can disable it if I really want to, but it'll kind of try and poke me into re-enabling it. So it's kind of all, it happens lazily. You set it up on the text field, and then the keyboard kind of does the right thing. Now, if I go back in here and I set up a different text field, drag another one out here, and we've got, no capitalization, auto correction. We'll go with the default one again. Alert, you probably don't want to do this in most places in your app, but just to show you kind of the difference. And then I build and run, and I tap between these two fields. You'll notice I get that different appearance. The return button changes. If I start typing something in here and I guess it's not going to auto-correct me too much there. But you saw an auto-correction pop-up appeared. So that all just sort of happens automatically. So any questions about that? Yeah?
Keyboard, does it always pop up from the bottom?
That's a good question. The question was, does the keyboard always pop up from the bottom? Most of the time, if you're viewing a static screen and the user taps on a text field, the keyboard should come up from the bottom of the screen. There are cases where if you set, so there's this become first responder method, which you can call on a text field or a text view to get it to begin editing programmatically rather than having the user tap. There are cases where if you do that, like during a view will appear, maybe during a push, the keyboard will try to do the right thing and match the rest of the screen so that if you become first responder, during a view will appear on a view controller, unless there's a bug or something, the keyboard should come in from the side of the screen.
Does this keyboard will cover that?
Right. So the question is, what about a text field in the bottom half of the screen? The most common thing you're going to want to do there, and actually we're not going to talk about it so much today, but we will next week, is that when the keyboard appears and disappears, there are some notifications which are posted globally in your application, which you can listen for, and then do things like adjusting the size of your views. Particularly, if you look back here at this app, as it's running, you'll notice this isn't a scroll view here. But if it were, I could do something like adjusting the content inset of the scroll view so that it would automatically sort of scroll as if, to compensate for the keyboard. So that's a really common thing to do. If you've just got a static view here that doesn't have scrolling, then you're in kind of a tough spot. You've got to move your views around or something like that. But more often than not, you've got a scroll view on the screen, and things will automatically kind of get worked out. I believe that UI table view controller will try to automatically compensate for the keyboard. So if you've got a UI table view controller and for some reason you've got a keyboard which displays, it'll try and adjust the content inset for you automatically. That's one of the sort of niceties of UI table view controller. But if you're rolling your own view controller, then you do need to adjust for the keyboard appearance yourself. And we're going to do a demo of that actually next week. So great question. Any other questions about this before we go back to the slides? So this is text input in your iPhone app. Not a lot of exposure in terms of methods and keyboard customization stuff directly to the keyboard. Think about it on the lazy sort of text input trait side. And now, for something completely different, but not really, we're going to be talking about modal content in your iPhone app. And this is, again, a really common place for you to have text input. I'm going to explain why. Modal content is really, when we talk about modal content, the most common places for this sort of presentation are when you're adding data to your application. Your user's inputting something like a new email message, a new SMS. They're adding maybe a new alarm, or maybe they're picking something like using the photo picker or the people picker in address book. So picking something, adding something. These are really common situations where you want your user to be in a modal state where they have to add that thing or pick that thing, and then they can either hit done or they can hit cancel. So for a couple examples here in the clock app, if the user hits that plus button up at the top of the screen, this view is going to cover the full screen, and then if they want, they can hit cancel and they can go back. But when they're in there, they can't tab around between stopwatch and timer and alarm. They're in that state and they need to, figure out what they're going to do or get out of there. Similarly, in SMS, we're going to see here, we're going to hit the compose button and a modal view is going to come up for entering a new SMS. And then from there, we're going to actually hit a button inside there and present an additional one, which will be sort of stacked on top. So we'll have a modal view controller and then another modal view controller. And then you can actually dismiss them one at a time as well. So let's hit that compose button. This new message comes up. Hit the plus button. The people picker comes up. Cancel out one at a time. And we're back where we started. Does that make sense? You want to see it one more time? So here's that. You can cancel. Here's the text message. You can go up like that. Hit the plus button. You can go add infinitum. I don't quite know how to pronounce that. I usually just read that phrase, but yeah. So that's what presenting content modally looks like in your app. So now let's see what the code is going to look like for that. If we want to present a view controller, there's a method that we're going to call, which is present modal view controller. You're going to invoke this on one view controller with the second view controller as the argument. So here, this is probably within a view controller subclass. So we're saying self present modal view controller. And then we've created this other view controller, this recipe add view controller, and we pass it as the argument. And much like pushing and popping, you can specify whether this should be animated or not. So here, when the user hits the plus button, that's going to bring up that add recipe sheet and cover up the whole screen. So just one method. On the flip side, so we're at this add recipe thing, and we've decided that we want to dismiss it. A key here, and you can probably guess what the method is called, but a key here is that when you're designing your app, probably the best way to do it, the way that we recommend, is to have the same object which kicked off the present should also do the dismiss. So rather than dismissing itself here, the add recipe view controller should maybe ping back to its parent and say, hey, I'm done. Do you want to dismiss me? And then the one underneath will say, so it gets this did add recipe message. Maybe it's a delegate message or something like that. And it'll say self dismiss modal view controller animated yes. You don't need to pass an argument here because every view controller has one modal view controller. So if we've got, in that case, an SMS, the one underneath, the conversation list, its modal view controller is the new SMS message view controller. And that guy's modal view controller is the people picker. So yeah, no argument needed. You can still pass animated yes or no. So when we call this add recipe, if all goes well, is going to go away. And one really interesting thing here is that you can have multiple navigation stacks, right? So in an application like like presence, where you've got navigation in the sort of main flow of the app between the person list and the person detail. Remember, navigation controllers are view controllers, just like anything else. You can present them modally, you can dismiss them. So if we've got a navigation stack underneath here, and then we call present modal view controller with another navigation controller, that guy can have its own stack. We can even push and pop underneath without animation, so that when you dismiss and you've added this recipe, you're viewing the new content in there. So this would be a situation where you've got maybe multiple navigation stacks, and after you've added some content, maybe in the one underneath, you want the user to be viewing the content that they just added. So that's kind of how you do that. I didn't show you any code, but you can kind of imagine how it would work. Any questions about that? Yeah. It's a good question. The question is, would you ever display a view controller modally via a tab bar press? I probably wouldn't. I mean, typically in iPhone apps, the expected behavior is that when you hit a tab bar button, it should switch you to that mode, but it shouldn't. It kind of feels weird when it does something else and it slides the view up. I know there are a couple of apps, well-known apps, which I won't name here, but that do that sort of thing. And I always feel a little sort of out of whack when that happens. When they decide, I hit a tab bar button and it slides some view up. Yeah, navigation buttons are a great place to put that, or just in the main content of your view. Now, one distinction worth making is between a tab bar and a toolbar, right? So tab bar is the view with the black background where you're switching between different modes. If for some reason you've got a toolbar, which is the blue, typically it's blue, and it's got those sort of buttons that you press. They don't stay highlighted; they just sort of momentarily flash. Something like the Mail application on the iPhone, where we've got Compose down there, we've got Reply. Hitting those, that could definitely present a view controller modally. If you imagine the Mail app, it's got a toolbar at the bottom of the screen, and hitting those toolbar buttons, much like hitting a navigation button up at the top, can present something modally. So, yeah, there's a lot, keeping tab bars versus toolbars can kind of be differentiated, can kind of be tricky sometimes, but that is a big distinction. Yeah. Right. That's a great question. How does the modally presented view controller ping back to whoever presented it and say, hey, it's time to dismiss me? The short answer here, well, there's a few ways to do it. You could, you could have a hard connection from the one that was modally presented back to its parent, so it can really directly trigger it. You could also use delegation, which we've mentioned a couple times before. And I'm going to show you an example using delegation in a little bit. So, there are many ways to do it. I'm going to show you one way, which I prefer, but ultimately there are a lot of ways to do it. Yeah. So the question is there a way to customize the direction or the animation for modally presented view controllers, or other cases where it's animated yes or no? This is an example of places in the iPhone SDK where we're kind of opinionated about how the app should behave and look. I guess arguing for consistency's sake, it might be kind of weird for the user if this thing came up with slid up from the bottom of the screen and then flew off to the left. We like the apps to be sort of consistent, and if something is modal, even if the user doesn't really realize ultimately what the difference is between the horizontal slides and vertical slides, it's nice to be consistent among apps. In the 2.x SDK, there is really no way to customize the appearance of modal view controllers. Yeah. I don't think we're ever going to expose, okay, you can do whatever crazy transition you want, but there have been requests for some types of customization there, especially for, anyways, yeah, enough said. Any other questions? Don't you guys love how I tease you with, allusions to future SDK versions, but then don't really? Yeah, okay. So yeah, you can have multiple navigation stacks here. You can have a navigation controller, present another navigation controller on top of it, push and pop there, push and pop underneath, dismiss, and they've got their own stacks. That's the key takeaway there. So yeah, dismissing a modal view controller. Who should do it? When? How should it happen? As I mentioned before, the best practice is for the same object to do the present and the dismiss. So whoever calls present modal view controller should also call dismiss modal view controller animated. So the way that I'm going to show you to do this is to define some delegate methods for the presented controller to notify its parent that it's ready to go away. This is how the image picker controller, the people picker controller work, and I'm going to show you a code example with all of those and with one that we write ourselves. So we tell the delegate, i.e. the parent, when we're done. The really nice thing here is that, for example, with the people picker, the photo picker, these modal view controllers can be used in a lot of different places without knowing about the specifics of the app. So the image picker controller doesn't need to know that it was presented by a Flickr app or a Facebook app or whatever. It does its thing, it messages back and says, hey, whoever's listening out there, I'm done, I picked this photo, you can dismiss me now if you want. It's really nice for reusability. The delegate, the parent, then makes the dismiss modal view controller call. So here we've got this parent controller, just because pretty pictures are fun. It called present modal view controller animated, got this child controller to display. We don't really show it here, but it sets itself as the delegate of the child. And then the child, when it's done, it says, hey, whoever my delegate is, I'm done. It's time for you to dismiss me. And then the parent will call dismiss, and the child goes away. So kind of what I just said there, but let's see some code. So I've got this Xcode project, which I've conveniently set up before class because I didn't want you to be bored by me writing a bunch of code, but I can definitely highlight the interesting portions here. If we wrap the lines, there's a default for that, probably. So we've got a pretty standard window-based application where we added a view controller to the window, and then we're going to be presenting a modal view controller in response to some actions. So the picker's view controller is what we add to the window at the very beginning. So, let me just see if there's a wrap setting here so I don't have to keep annoying you guys. Text editing, show gutter, code focus, no. Anyone know where that is? Ha, no. Yeah, is that it? Yay, all right, a little bit better. So in our app delegate, the usual thing here, we create this view controller, the picker's view controller. We get its view, we set the frame, we add it to the window, blah, blah, blah. Old news by now. The picker's view, if I crack this open in Interface Builder, we've got a few buttons. We've got a couple of labels and an image view. And if we look at the class here, first of all in the header, well, first of all, you see that there's this monster declaration of all of the delegate protocols which we conform to. This is kind of a, when you're using delegates, especially if you're a delegate of multiple objects, your class declaration can be a little long, but yeah, it's kind of how the cookie crumbles. So we're an image picker controller delegate, a people picker, navigation controller delegate, and this other delegate protocol that we're going to define ourselves. But we're just a straight up view controller subclass. We've got a couple of outlets, which you are now intimately familiar with. We've got an image view, a person label, and a type something label. As we saw here, you can see them right here, 1, 2, 3. We're already set up as our the file's owner here. And the connections are made from us to the image view, the person label, the type something label. The view is the whole thing here. And then the received actions, we've got some IB actions, show image picker, show people picker, show type something. So these are all going to be invoked by these buttons here. Now if we look at the actual implementation here, we've got our synthesized properties. Inside view to load, we're just going to set some default text for those text labels, pick a person, type something already. I guess I could have done that in Interface Builder, but old habits die hard when you're a programmatic view hacker. So then in this show image picker IB action, I'm going to instantiate a UI image picker controller. Standard, it's a view controller subclass, alloc init. I'm going to set the source type. I want this thing to pick images from my photo library. And the delegate of the image picker is going to be us. So this is how the delegate relationship works. We're presenting this thing. We are its delegate. And then I'm going to call self present modal view controller with the image picker controller with animation. And then I'm going to release. A presented modal view controller is automatically retained by the sort of presentation machinery. So unless we need to do something with it afterwards, we don't need to hold on to it here. One convention with delegate methods, it's a convention to pass self, from the point of view of the image picker. It's a convention to pass self as the first argument here, just so that, like in this case, we didn't retain a reference to the image picker controller. Does that make sense? We set it and we forget it. I don't remember what infomercial that's from, but Ronco. So we didn't retain a reference to it. But we get it back as one of the arguments to the delegate method here. So the image picker controller has a couple of delegate methods for either canceling or for picking an image. If we go back here, well, actually, if I command double-click an Xcode on UI image picker controller, here's the header. You'll notice it's in the UIKit framework, headers. This is where you would find it. So this class is defined. It's actually a navigation controller. There's all these things you can ask if the source type is available for things like cameras, because there is no camera in the simulator and on iPod touches, but there is one on the iPhone. Set the source type, which you saw me doing in code there. Allows image editing, so like once you pick an image, can you crop it or not? And then here's the delegate protocol. So you declare at protocol, UI image picker, controller, delegate, and it protocols can conform to other protocols. This is just a sort of, kind of like subclassing NSObject. It's nice to, in addition to the NSObject class, there's an NSObject protocol, which is a sort of starting point for protocols. All these sort of things here, like self and class and superclass. And here are the methods. They're defined. They're all optional, so you don't necessarily need to implement them. Although you probably should if you want to do anything useful here. Same thing for the address book people picker navigation controller. A little more verbosely named, but same sort of deal here. We allocate this thing, we set the delegate as us, we present it modally, and then we release it. Now in the delegate callbacks here for the image picker, if they picked an image, what are we going to do? Kind of obvious. We're going to set the image views image as the image that was passed in, and then we'll call self dismiss modal view controller animated yes. We'll do that both in the picking case and in the canceling case. Does that make sense? So the same object is presenting and dismissing. Same deal with the AB people picker controller. When we cancel, we just dismiss. When we select a person, you can determine, notice here, this delegate method returns a Boolean. People picker navigation controller should continue after selecting person. So if you return no here, nothing will happen once a person is selected. If we return yes, then it'll do that thing where it pushes into the details for that person. So if you wanted to pick out, a phone number, a specific email address, or something like that, you would return yes here. We don't care about it for this example. We're just going to be getting the name from the person, setting it as the person label. This is a good time to plug next Monday's lecture, where Alex Abis of the iPhone applications and frameworks team is going to be coming in and talking about everything address book related on the phone. It's going to be chock full of good information. You're going to need to know it for Presence 4, and it's another opportunity to, have an Apple engineer in here for you to, pester with difficult questions and, freak them out. So yeah, definitely come to that one. Alex has spoken in a lot of developers conferences before. He's a smart guy and fun to listen to. So same thing here. We set the text on the label, we dismiss animated, and we return no. Here, we just had to implement this one for the, because we're not actually getting into the address book cards. We're not going to be pushing in that extra level. But this is what would happen if we allowed that and somebody selected a phone number. What should happen when something gets selected. Yeah, so that's how you use the image picker and the people picker view controllers modally. Now, for the third example, actually, let's build and run this and kind of show you what's going on. So here, if I select image picker, this thing comes up, covers the whole screen. I've got some stock images here in the simulator, so I can go to Hawaii and pick this, sunset or whatever, and it'll actually set it as my image view. So I was able to display that thing and get something back from it without it knowing too much about me being the root view controller. Same thing with the people picker. I can pick, I've always been a John Appleseed person myself, so we picked that, and John Appleseed got set as the text here. If I, instead go for Hank, I can pick a new image here from Slovenia. All that kind of works all wonderfully right there. So now let's talk about this third bit here, because this is what's probably most interesting to you, implementing your own view controller with some delegate methods. This is very relevant to the Presence 3 assignment, because you're going to be implementing a compose view for your Twitter client. That compose view comes up with a text field. You input some text, type your status, as Al did when he was hacking my Twitter stream on Monday, and then dismiss it. So let's take a look here at this type something view controller class. So I declare, it's a subclass of UI view controller. It's got a text field, and it's got a delegate, because you always need to, if you've got a delegate, you need to refer to it somehow. Sorry, question?
Can you say something about
Yeah, so why is the IB outlet declared on the property but not on the instance variable? You can do it either way, actually. Especially, particularly if you don't even declare the property, then you are going to want to declare it straight up on the IVAR. Yeah, it's kind of just a style thing. One thing to keep in mind is that, let's say I didn't have a property for this UI text field here. I declared IB outlet up here, just on the instance variable. And I didn't have a setter defined. I didn't have synthesized text field equals whatever. The route that it's going to go through there to actually, when it connects the file's owner to the nib as it's loaded, because there is no setter defined, it's going to use this method, which is built into all NS objects, set value for key, which is a sort of generic way of setting an instance variable. And what that method does actually is it retains the incoming value. So if you haven't explicitly implemented a setter method for something that's an IB outlet, that thing by default will be retained. And even though you didn't actually type retain anywhere, you need to release that in your dealloc method. Just a little bit of trivia. It's kind of tricky, but that's kind of what'll happen if you haven't implemented your own setter for an IB outlet. Does that make sense? So okay, it's kind of on the trivia side, but good to be aware of. Some of you may have been caught by that on some of the previous assignments. So I've got these properties defined. Now you'll notice for the delegate, I've declared it as assign rather than retain. As we mentioned a couple of lectures ago, delegates typically are assigned to avoid retain cycles, where you've got some parent, which is retaining the child, and then the child is retaining the parent via the delegate property. So this is the convention here, if that makes sense. Actually, let's, from here, take a look at what the nib actually looks like. I gave it a little pretty red background just to differentiate it. We've got a text field. We've got a button. Files owner, as usual, is declared as the, that's not right. Oh, wrong nib. There we go. The files owner is the type something view controller. I've got some connections set up. The text field is pointing at the text field over there. The view is pointing at the entire view. The done button is going to be calling done button pressed on the file's owner. All good on this front. So, obviously we've got the done button pressed right here. And then for defining the delegate protocol, so I type at protocol, type something view controller delegate. It's usually nice just for, it's kind of what's expected. Use the name of the class plus delegate for the name of the delegate protocol. And then we're going to have one optional method, type something view controller. We pass ourself as the first argument, and we'll say did type something, and that'll be the text. And we're going to invoke this. If we look at the implementation here, hopefully this kind of gels things together. We've got our synthesized text field and delegate properties. We've got our dealloc where we're releasing that text field. And here in done button pressed, because it's an optional method, we need to check. We need to say, hey, do you actually respond to this selector? Because maybe you don't. Response to selector, at selector, type something view controller did type something. So if it does, then we'll actually invoke it. We'll on the delegate, we'll invoke the method, we'll pass ourself as the first argument, and we'll pass the text field's text as the second argument. Does that make sense? So notice we call it from the type something view controller, and we implement this method where? Anyone? Bueller? In the picker's view controller, in the one underneath where we called show type something. We, just like we did with the image picker, the people picker, we allocate this thing, initialize it, set the delegate to us, we present it modally, and then we release it. So then when it's all done, it'll say to us, when the user presses that done button, we'll get this message because we implemented this optional protocol method. We'll get this callback, and we can then take that text and set it on our text label. That'll cause it to, our text label to be updated, and then we'll dismiss animated. Does that make sense? So you'll definitely want to refer to this as you are implementing Presence 3, because it's a pretty good model. So again, if we fire this up in the simulator, image picker, let's pick an image, white sandy beach, people picker, type something. This thing comes up. We've got some placeholder text. Looks like I've got the automatically lowercase everything text input trait selected. Hello world. And when I hit done here, that's going to call back and set this on the text label. Let's actually, we've got a couple minutes, so let's attach in the debugger and actually see how this method flow takes place. So I'm going to set a breakpoint right there in the done button pressed action method. Does that make sense? If you skipped Troy's debugging session, this is a sort of mini crash course. I believe actually setting that will enable, yeah. So deactivate breakpoints. Yeah. So breakpoints are activated at this point. If I hit type something, I type some new text like Al is hungry and wants a burrito, and I hit done. You'll notice here we are. We're in the done button pressed action callback. If I want, I can mouse over self-delegate, and it'll tell me, hey, the self-delegate, we're in the type something view controller. Self-delegate is the picker's view controller, just like we expected. So it's going to check, hey, do you respond to that selector? Type something view controller, did type something. Very common mistake here is to mistype this method signature, the selector, or leave off a colon or something like that. In which case, nothing will happen because you're typing in some method that it doesn't actually respond to. Yeah, very, 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 very common pitfall. I'm sure will happen to at least 10 of you as you're implementing Presence 3. But if I step over here, I can either press Apple Shift O, or I can press the step over button. This will evaluate to true. So at this point, I'm going to invoke the type something view controller did type something method on my delegate. Yeah. It's a good question. So how does it know that this object responds, this selector? Is it a compile time thing, a runtime thing? It actually happens at runtime. And one interesting thing, which we're going to cover in a couple of weeks as a sort of coda to the class, is how you can actually mess around with the Objective-C runtime and add methods, switch methods around, all sorts of really dirty stuff. Well, some of it's useful, some of it's really dirty, and you should never ship an app that does it. But it's sort of like telling your kids about drugs or something. You'd rather they hear it from you than from some guy on the street. So short answer, it's dynamic. It happens at runtime, and actually via adding categories. That's a really common way to modify the set of methods that an object responds to, or selectors. Sorry. Yeah.
Is this passing?
Right. So the question is, how does this compare to notifications? This is another way to communicate indirectly between these two objects. I would say in this case, where it's clear that there's probably just one other actor who's interested in this, using delegation probably makes sense. Notifications make more sense in a case where maybe there's multiple people who are interested in hearing about this. So something like maybe we've got some image loading operation that finished, and maybe there's multiple places that want to hear about this image having been loaded so that they can reload a table view or they can update some image view. That would be a case where maybe a notification would make sense. Typically, if there's from the design standpoint, if you know that there's going to be one interested party, delegation probably makes more sense. But ultimately, these things are judgment calls, and everyone has their own preferences. So did the answer about the runtime check make sense? We'll be delving a little bit more deeply into that later in the course. Do you have a question?
Yeah, what is the type of your delegate IVAR?
Good question. So what is the type of the delegate here? It's a type ID, but we add this little less than, the name of the protocol, kind of awkward when it's a really long protocol name, and then greater than, basically saying that this is, it's a generic ID pointer that conforms to the type something view controller delegate protocol. If I wanted, one thing we could do here, if this was a non-optional method, if we said anyone who conforms to this needs to implement this protocol, then we don't need to do that response to selector check. So yeah, that's actually probably worth showing. Well, actually, let me finish walking through here in the debugger, but then I'll show that it works that way too. So from here, if I step in to this call, type something view controller to type something, it'll get the delegate. It's a synthesized property, so it's not going to show you anything. Keep stepping, and we actually get into the pickers view controller implementation, and we'll see, it's going to set the label in that bottom view controller. Does that make sense? So that's sort of how the message flow happens. Sometimes it's helpful to visualize that. Let's show off what this would look like so before this was optional, so I had to check whether it actually responded to the property or to the selector. If I get rid of that, then I could just say,
and that will be enforced by the compiler.
It will be enforced by the compiler. So if I hit build here, it should be all good. Now, if in the pickers view controller, you can hit Apple /nextcode to just comment out a block of code, kind of handy. If I build now, I'll get a warning. It'll say incomplete implementation of class pickers view controller. Method definition for that delegate was not found. So basically it's saying, you said that you conformed to this delegate protocol, but you really didn't. It's not going to be an error in that case, but it is a warning. So that can kind of, sometimes it is more helpful to be strict and help you to avoid those types of errors. And that also helps you avoid if you mistype, it does respond to selector check. Do you have a question? No, you just, okay. So again, if we build and run here, now it's no longer an optional method. We can take out a couple lines of code. Yep, it still works. So this will be up on the website if you want to review it or crib some ideas from it. Yeah.
Is the return key on the keyboard, is that hooked up to the done button?
It could be. In this case, it wasn't. But if I wanted to, there is actually, we still got time? Yeah, we got a couple minutes. If we flip back here into Xcode. Sorry. The question was, is there a way to hook up the return key on the keyboard to perform the same action as the done button? So if I look here on UI text field.h, as we mentioned, you can customize text fields in a bunch of different ways, the traits, as well as delegate methods. If I scroll down here, it's kind of squished with the big font size and the small screen and the wrapping. But so you'll see protocol, UI text field delegate, yet another delegate protocol. These are all optional methods. We can say should begin editing, did begin editing, should end editing, did end editing, should change characters in range with replacement string. So this is where if you wanted to prevent the number 7 from being typed, you could check it here and return no if you don't want the characters to be entered. This text field should return is the method that you would implement if you wanted to do something in response to the return button on the virtual keyboard being pressed. So in the previous example, if I wanted to use this, I would set the type something view controller as the text field's delegate. I would implement this method, and probably what I would do here is, returning yes or no probably doesn't matter, but I would call the done button clicked, or I would just, have the same implementation in there. So this would get called anytime the return key gets pressed, if that makes sense. I can add that to the demo before, or to the example project before we throw it up on the website. Any other questions before we wrap this up? All right, so hopefully not too much stuff to throw at you all at once, but this is pretty useful, and it's how we would really recommend that you plug these sorts of things together. Just a reminder, presence part 3, your goals. First of all, avoid expensive work on the main thread, because as we've discussed a few times now, this is bad for things like the iPhone where you don't necessarily know what your connectivity is going to be like. Use background threads to keep your UI responsive, and you can take a sort of higher level approach to threading by using the NS operation and NS operation queue classes. Presence 3 was posted on the website last night, or maybe this morning, depending on where you live in the world. And we're actually going to ask you to do a couple different types of NS operations. There'll be one case where we want you to just use an NS invocation operation, which doesn't require creating a subclass. And there's another case where we want you to actually create an NS operation subclass and override the main method on NS operation. The other goal is to allow the user to update their own status. So you're going to have some text input traits. You can customize that however you like. And you're going to present a view modally to allow this to work. Same thing here. There's this new method in Twitter helper for updating your status. Again, that's a synchronous method. You probably don't want the whole UI to be hung when that happens. So you're going to want to use an NS operation to do that work on the background thread as well. And that's it. Any questions? Good to go. All right. Thank you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.